I fell in love not once, but twice, before I was 6 years old. How amazing. I'm sure you're thinking, I can't imagine that. Well, you can probably imagine falling in love twice before you were 6 years old. But what is really hard to imagine is to picture this ancient relic of a man standing in front of you today as a 6-year-old boy. But I can tell you that once upon a time, long, long ago, in a small country town in southern Indiana, in the 1940s, I was a 6-year-old boy. Now, I had two loves. Kids these days have these things. But in the 1940s, they weren't even invented yet. But I had something even more useful and even more valuable. My imagination. That was my first love, my imagination. The other thing that I had was a possession. I had my Schwinn bicycle. And when you put those two things together, it was powerful. When I was on my bicycle, under an open sky, with the wind in my face, and with my imagination activated, I could be anyone, anywhere. I could be a clipper ship captain, sailing around and charting unexplored seas. Or I could be a space cadet on a secret spy mission out beyond the rings of Saturn. Or I could be a Shoshone boy on an Appaloosa pony, galloping across a plain of purple sage. I could be anyone, anywhere. But as expansive as my world was, my imaginary world, it was greatly constricted by the rules that my mother had for where I could ride my bicycle. When I came out of our driveway, I couldn't turn to the left because just a few houses down was Hendrick Street. That was a really dangerous street. It was the only paved street that we had in our neighborhood. And in the 1940s, cars were speeding on Hendrick Street. They might even have been going 10 or 12 miles an hour. How dangerous was that? I also couldn't leave my driveway and just go out into Columbia Street because the rule was you never ride your bicycle in the street, only on the sidewalk. So there was really only one option. I had to turn to the right. But there were also restrictions there. I still remember my mother's voice. Little Paul, never ride your bicycle any farther than the Woodall house. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the Woodall house was only 3 houses from my house, the White House. October 30th, 1947 was a beautiful autumn day. The sky was that steel blue that you get in Indiana. That's a harbinger of a cold winter soon to come. God had imbued the leaves with splendor from his palette. And those leaves were whirling and twirling in a light autumnal breeze. The smell of burnt leaves from the bonfire the night before was in the air. And I got on my bicycle. I rode out of the driveway, and of course, I turned to the right because I always really tried to be an obedient child. So I started pedaling really hard in front of the Oliver house. I was almost at full speed in front of the Armstrong house. And then all too soon, there came the Woodall house. On that beautiful day, it seemed like a day for exploration and discovery. So instead of stopping and turning around and going back to the White House, I put my head down. I started to pedal even harder, and I zipped right past the Woodall house. And there I was, out in a new universe. But very soon I saw the biggest, blackest car that I had ever seen, turning off of Ashley Street onto Columbia Street. It stopped about 10 houses from me on the opposite side of Columbia Street, and I started to slow down. That car, I saw the doors open. 3 women came out of that car. They were dressed in black from head to toe. And it seemed like they floated out of the car. They floated around and up on the sidewalk. And they then floated up to the porch of the house that I knew as a deal house. By that time, I had stopped and I was holding my handlebars really tightly. My mouth was agape. My eyes were as big as saucers as I watched those, what my brain was telling me, Halloween witches. The deal house door opened. The first witch floated in. The second witch floated in. And then the third witch, who was the oldest and the ugliest of the three witches. She was wrinkled and pale with a big nose. She started to float in, but then she stopped. She turned around and her beady eyes focused right on my panicked eyes. Now, here comes an interesting part of this story. Personal stories, true stories. You might think that I'm faking it, and many people have told me that it was probably my boyish imagination. But here's what I saw. I saw that old witch, the ugly witch, start to raise her hand really slowly like this. Then there was a flash, and a blue bolt of lightning came across Columbia Street. It hit me so hard it knocked me off my bicycle. Ouch! I cried as my knee hit an unforgiving sidewalk. Oof! I groaned as my bicycle fell on top of me. When I opened my eyes, the first thing I did was I looked across Columbia Street to the deal house. The old witch was not there. And then I looked at my knee because it hurt so much. My pants leg was torn, my knee was bloody and split open, and as I looked at that blood, a very unwelcome, warm, wet sensation started to form in the front of my pants. And I knew that I was in deep doo-doo for several reasons. First of all, I had broken my mother's rule. I had torn my pants leg. My knee was bloody, and I had wet my pants. I knew I had to get out of there. Dilly-dally was not the word of the day. So I stood up, I turned my bicycle around, heading back for home. And as I got on my bicycle, unbeknownst to me, my knee was so sore that my foot hit the chain of the bicycle, knocking the chain right off of the sprocket. But I was oblivious to that, and I started to pedal as hard as I could pedal. And the bicycle was not moving. My mind was telling me, it's a witch's spell. So I threw the bewitched bicycle down and I started to run as hard as I could run towards home. When I got to the Woodall house, I looked up and through tear-filled eyes, I saw my mother standing in front of the White House, arms akimbo. And I'd ask all of the mothers, how do mothers know? Now, we had a cherry tree in our front yard, and the next thing I looked for was whether my mother had a cherry tree switch or not in her hand, because corporal punishment back in the 1940s was not a human right. It was not a violation. So if you've never felt a cherry tree switch on bare skin, I can tell you it really, really hurts. But my mother didn't have a switch. In fact, she saw that I was distressed. So as I was running towards her, she came running towards me and she took me in her arms. Little Paul, what happened? Are you okay? Why is your pants torn? Your knee's bloody. Where's your bicycle? The Grand Inquisition ended with, did you wet your pants? Well, but she said, as mothers always do in a calming voice, let's go find your bicycle. So she took me by the hand and we started to walk back. Of course, she was looking for the bicycle. I was looking across the street at the deal house. And sure enough, when we got to the bicycle, the front door opened and the three witches floated out onto the porch. I saw them, my mother saw them, and I thought, she is so brave. But then the old witch, the ugly witch, the one with the pale face and the big nose, stepped out in front of the other two. And she started to raise her hand again slowly. So I hid behind my mother's skirt tails. a safe place. And from that safe place, I heard that old witch cackle to my mother. "Why, Lillian, is that your son?" And my mother jerked me from her dress and said, "Yes, this is my little man. This is my little Paul." And I could not believe it. My mother was not only talking to a witch, she had put me in harm's way, and she had told that witch my name. I closed my eyes, waiting for the worst. But when I opened them again, the witches had floated off of the porch and had gotten into that big black car, and they were driving away. And as they drove away, all three witches waved at my mother, and my mother smiled and waved back at them. On that October 30th day in 1947, I learned 3 life's lessons. First of all, as a kid, you should always obey your parents. It doesn't make any difference what their rules are. They might not make sense to you, but the rules are there for a reason. The second thing I learned is that I needed to start doing something to separate fantasy from reality. And in fact, that was 70 years ago, and I still have a problem separating fantasy from reality. In fact, just this morning, but that's another story for another time. The third thing I learned is the most important lesson of all. That is the day when I learned all about religion. Because those witches weren't witches at all, they were Catholic nuns. That's when I learned that while you can't always judge a book by its cover, you can always know a nun by her habit. Thank you.